Hello, everybody, and welcome to the introduction to Kenneth Burke. This is part one. This is a two-part series, and the reason why I made it two videos instead of one is just that to really unpack even just a sliver of Burke. One video was a little bit too long, so I did break this up into two. We'll talk about what each of them are going to do, and then I want to kind of start with this caveat in that Kenneth Burke, one, we could spend, multiple semesters on just Burke and unpacking and really diving into all of the contributions that he made to multiple different fields, but specifically rhetoric. So these two videos are really just meant to provide, let's say, a framework or bring certain things into focus. It's going to lay a foundation. You're going to be able to kind of take the readings that we did and we're going to bring them into focus and looking at just some specific things. By no means is this meant to be a way to become a Burke expert. It's merely a way to get to know Burke just a little bit. So there's a little bit of fear on my part in that what I don't want to do is flatten Burke's concepts or ideas in any way, shape, or form, but really just kind of meant to introduce them. Let's dip our toe in a little bit. And then as we get into, let's say, discussion boards or other things, we can take these concepts and apply them deeper. So this is very much just an introduction to. So in order to get ready, make sure you have everything that you need. Obviously, this is a video, so you can stop at any time you want, but make sure that you've got all your necessary things. If you're taking notes, that's going to be important. Not so much to, let's say, quote unquote, copy anything down. Yeah, obviously you have the access to this video, so you can come back and look at these concepts at any time, but I really want you to use your notes as a way to almost respond to or jot questions down that will lead us when we get to the discussion board piece as we walk through these. So even if we look at a specific example of something, be thinking of another example that might use the Burke's concept in that same way. You're going to be asked throughout the videos to stop at different points, write down some quick responses or even reflections to the materials. I think this video only has one, but so it's going to be important to have something that you have to kind of write with. All right, what to expect. So again, this is a two-part series. Isn't that fabulous? It sounds so official. It's a two-part series. We're going to discuss the background of Kenneth Burke just to kind of get to know him. And then we want to discuss some of Burke's major contributions to rhetoric through the following things, or key terms, key concepts, I should say. And that is language as symbolic action, motivation, dramatism, identification, and terministic screens. That's a lot. And again, uh, we're going to dip our toe in, like into the sea of Burke, but we are no means taking any deep dives in these videos. We'll do that in later conversations. So the first two, language is symbolic action and motivation, we're going to dive into in this particular video. However, motivation will be running throughout. So almost think of these as a way to kind of understand Burke in his work with language and symbolic action, moving into the motivation. And then we'll specifically in the second video get into the dramatism, his pentad, the dramatistic pentad, the idea of identification and disidentification, and then of course terministic screens. Okay, so while it is a two-part series, they work together to kind of tell the whole story, so to speak, or the whole introduction. So before we get into that, let's talk about modern and postmodern rhetoric for just a second. We left off with this, right? This was the last thing we kind of talked about, and we really just introduced it so that we can use this lens as we look at the different people that we're going to focus on over the next few weeks, with Burke being the first. So during this particular time, rhetoric becomes a valuable interdisciplinary theory. Remember, prior to this, rhetoric had kind of dropped off the radar. We saw that happening, in 19th century rhetoric, where we see this shift in rhetoric with regards to what it's being kind of moved into different areas. Composition begins to take a more prominent role. So the idea of rhetoric kind of drops off the radar. So in modern and postmodern, rhetoric then has to or does kind of carve a new space at the table for itself. And so it becomes a valuable interdisciplinary theory of language and meaning. Um, and it grows to encompass a theory of language as a form of social behavior, intention interpretation as the determinants of meaning, the way that knowledge is created by argument, and the way that ideology and power are extended through language. Now, we can, of course, have these same conversations with all of the other eras of rhetoric that we've looked at. We can apply these same things. These are in the modern and postmodern rhetoric, a more intentional view of them. So, rhetoric begins to expand its grasp to incorporate the ways that women, people of color, and cultural or ethnic minorities use language to gain a hearing for themselves. We start to see that conversation happening. We had a similar conversation with that with regards to the 19th century. Um, and of course, we go back to those questions we asked at the beginning of the semester, right? Where, and this was one of the QQCs of, why do we call it feminist rhetoric or Black feminist rhetoric? Why not just rhetoric? So in modern and postmodern, we start to see that the reason, right, the exigence for understanding the ways in which multiple voices use language. Rhetoric becomes a comprehensive theory of language as effective discourse, and these themes include things like language and meaning, ethics and ideology, argument and knowledge. And again, it's not as though we can't have these conversations with the other eras or other spaces of rhetoric, but in modern and postmodern now we take a more intentional view of them. So we're going to specifically kind of hang out with language and meaning with Burke. And that is not to say that ethics and ideology, argument and knowledge don't also come into play. They absolutely do. But for Burke, it all stems from this idea of language and meaning. Okay, so let's do a quick free write. So I'm going to ask you to stop the video in just a second and just kind of jot down a couple of these things. Right, you read those pieces that were posted, and so I want to just know what your takeaways are. Right, you posted on the QQC, so just kind of in your free write before we even get into this, just kind of the takeaways. And I'll give you an example. When I first encountered Burke, um, he was one of those folks, and he continues to be on so many levels, that was very challenging. He wasn't somebody that I read and could put down and walk away with a true understanding of the philosophies or ideas that he was coming to. I think I could get some of them, but it really has taken a while to kind of put them together. And again, I'm nowhere near where I would like to be. I think Burke is one of those people that you continually go back to, and he's, fortunately or unfortunately, once you have Burke in your head, it's like you see him everywhere. And I would say that with some of the other folks as well, but Burke in particular, because of his tie to language and motivation and meaning and symbols, he just continually pops up. So he's a very fun person to hang out with a little bit. He's also a challenging, because the way he writes is not, in some cases, for example, he'll give a point and then he'll go on for pages, uh, almost giving examples, but in kind of a stream of consciousness way in his writing, and then he'll come back to his point. So it's almost through that stream of consciousness or the chaos of that you are able to get those points. So just take a couple of minutes and tell me what you walked away with regards to Burke. So before we get into understanding some of his concepts, let's look at who Kenneth Burke was and or is. We can speak to him, his ideologies anyway, in the present tense. He's a rhetorician, a poet, philosopher, historian, a literary theorist. He's so many things, right? He was a biblical scholar. He was um, a self-made scholar in the sense that he dropped out of college twice. He spent one semester at two different colleges. He found that type of education is too constraining and he wanted to study on his own, so he did. He wanted to write rather than follow a path towards college professorship, so he did. So again, he's a self-made scholar whose ideas, whose work is influential in several fields of knowledge where symbols are central focus of study. He brings this idea of psychological and social together with regards to language and looking at the motives, where cognitive psychologists remind us that consciousness arises from language. Well, Burke went much further. For him, language isn't the residue of something or of some other experience, it frequently is the experience. And so for Burke, we're driven by labels used by and applied to us. Let me say that again. For Burke, we are driven by labels or symbols that are used by us and also applied to us. In other words, we live in a sea of verbal constructions. And many look at Burke as a motive scholar because he uses this framework of language. He's very interested in the way that the world of human action, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, action and motion, is one filled with motives. So it's the why. Why is it this way? Why and how? Why is language? Why do we use the language that we use? Why do we respond the way that we do? What are the motives behind that? And we'll really dive into that when we look at his dramatistic pentad, when he looks at the 5 areas of his pentad with regards to perspective. He looks at these motives through the language used to describe or respond to situations, and he had a keen sense of the centrality of language to human thought and action. And so his work is really centered around the language that we use and is used by us. We'll talk about that in just a second. He created an entire school of study called dramatism. And again, that will be in the second video. The study of language as a mode of action. So, quick fun fact, he was actually the grandfather of Harry Chapin. I know this is really silly, but I came upon this by happenstance when I was diving into or preparing for prelims and just trying to find, I always try to get to know these people that I'm reading. I want to know these different fun facts. It helps me connect to them a little bit better. And interestingly enough, so Harry Chapin is a singer-songwriter from the 60s and 70s, someone I listen to a lot. And so you may or may not have ever heard of him, and I totally get that. I know that this is really silly, but you may be familiar with this particular song. It's one that is, we hear often, or it's one, if you know of anything, you may not even know that this was Harry Chapin, but you know the song.
A child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking before I knew it. And as he grew, he'd say, I'm gonna be like you, Dad. You know I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy to the man on the phone. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then.
All right. So you can go back and listen to the whole song. But that is interesting when I start connecting or looking. Anyway, just a fun fact. Sorry for the detour. So when we look at the key concepts or Burkeology, some people will call this Burkeology, we're going to look at these 3 things. Language as symbolic action, which is what we're going to dive into in this particular video. Language as symbolic action is the name of the book. It's a concept, but it's also the name of the book where the essay Definition of Man came out of, which is actually what we're going to dive into over the next few minutes. And then, of course, in that second video, we're going to look at dramatism and terministic screen, understanding that there's a lot of almost sub-concepts that we'll unpack with each of these. So let's just start here, because we're always interested in these different people that we've read or that we've encountered, of how do they define rhetoric, or how do they discuss rhetoric. So there's just a couple of things. There'll be one a little bit later on, but these two pieces in particular. The basic function of rhetoric is the use of words by human agents to form attitudes or to induce actions in other human agents. And then, of course, rhetoric is the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. So if we look at his work of understanding, um, the fact that we are driven by the labels and the symbols and that we use, he forms his idea of rhetoric is shaped around those, right? The use of words, human agents that form attitudes, induce actions for others, right? So yes, there's a persuasive nature to this, but for Burke, he wants to understand it from the side of why, the motivation behind why we do that. So again, we're going to dive into the definition of man, and Language is Symbolic Action is the book where this essay came out of, where these different lectures come out of, right? So these are different lectures regarding this. So what's interesting is, and I know this sounds really weird, but if you ever have a chance to check this book out, if you don't have it, it is actually really good if you want to dive into Burke a little bit more. You're all majors within the field of rhetoric and composition in some way, be it communication, be it EWM majors. So his ideas are one that I think you'll find kind of everywhere. Again, once you see him, you can't unsee him. So in this particular essay, Definition of Man, and I start with this because it gives us an idea of him unpacking, right, this definition, or how he sees it. So in the essay, he argues for a definition of human or man that demonstrates the ways in which language structures our behavior and our reality. So language structures our behavior and reality. And so the question, and this is a quote from him, we want to kind of keep in our minds, do we simply use words, or do they not also use us? And I think it's interesting. It's kind of one of my favorites because it really does speak to kind of this reciprocal or synergistic nature of language as not only shaping us, but us shaping it. And so he makes 5 claims about the nature of man in this particular essay. And while we're going to parse through each 5 kind of individually, I want you to be thinking about them collectively as well, because they're not individual pieces that work without each other, right? They are simply ways of looking at the whole of the definition, but unpacking it piece by piece. And so we'll list them here, and then we're going to go into them specifically. Man is the symbol using, symbol making, symbol misusing animal. Man is the inventor of the negative, or moralized by the negative. Man is separated from his nature, from his natural condition by instruments of his own making. Man is goaded by the spirit of hierarchy or moved by the sense of order, and man is rotten with perfection. So again, these are the 5 claims that make up his kind of definition or nature of man or human. And so we want to think about them holistically, but first let's dive into them individually, and then we can start making those connections. So the first one is symbol using and symbol misusing animal. And so for Burke, symbol use and misuse is the most important thing that defines humans, right? He says reality is mediated through the use and misuse of symbols. And he really poses the question of how much of reality is built on the symbols and the language that we use, right? Humans' reality is created through the use of symbols. So let that sink in for just a second. You can probably look at some of the examples that might play in there. Along with that, languages are, for Burke, ideologies. To learn a language or to be in a language is to get co opted by a certain perspective. And we'll look at this further when we look at terministic screens as well, is that our language and the language that we use are shaping or are our identities or ideologies, and to learn that language is co-opted by a certain perspective. So one of the questions that's posed is, are there things that lie outside of language? I think it's an interesting question because perhaps we could consider that, but as soon as we do, we bring it into language, right? Because we start to create symbols, and we substitute that thing that's lying outside of language for the symbol, right? So a symbol is substitutable. Words stand in for things or acts driven by motives. So when we think about things that might lie outside of language, it might, however, the second we consider it, it's now within language. Kind of interesting to think about. This idea of substitutable. So words stand in for things or acts driven by motives, right? So let's take a look. And again, I'm going to apologize because throughout we're going to bring it back to kind of our current moment and where we're living right now, which is the idea of the pandemic that we're in right now. And so this image has been circulated everywhere. This is, for all intents and purposes, kind of, if we were to label it, it's COVID-19 or coronavirus, right? This is what is associated, or this is the image that is depicted. Corona, meaning crown, because they say this looks like a crown, or the little pieces look like a crown. Anyhow, so if we say this is this substitute for this thing, which if we wanted to say, oh, this lies outside of language, well, now we have a symbol for it. We've substituted this for coronavirus or COVID-19. But let's let's take it a little bit further and look at the acts driven, right? The motives that symbolize this thing. So if we say this is coronavirus or COVID-19, now we can assign, or we can think about language that are driving the acts attached to it. So case in point, the mere fact that you're listening to this versus the fact that we're sitting in a classroom and we're able to kind of chat with each other is an act or something that happened motivated by which is negotiable, or we could talk about or argue about, is that it's motivated by the idea of keeping everybody healthy and safe and away from and stop the spread of coronavirus. So now we have not only something that we call this coronavirus or COVID-19, but now we also have acts that are driven by this one thing. So and then there's motivation behind that, right? All right. So let's move on to the second one, inventor of and invented by the negative. So I know it's silly, you see a table sitting there. For Burke, humans have uniquely invented the negative. This means that we are able to think about what's not the case or what is not there. So we'll start with a table, right? For Burke, there are no negatives in nature. Once you introduce symbolicity, once you introduce language or symbols, you can have paradoxical senses of negativity affecting the world. So, silly example, the table. And this is something that we used in my Rhet theory class a few semesters ago, is that we now know, or we have a label for this. We have a symbol for this. This is a table. We see this and we assign the language table. Once we do that, we can also spend the rest of our lives walking around and looking at what is not a table, right? So we have this ability to live in the negative. Now, this is a very easy and non-abstract concept, table versus not table, right? It's either a table or it's not table. However, when we think about the negative for Burke, it's not a thing, but a principle or idea that governs our responses and codes of morality, right? So he talks about the don'ts. The simplest thing that I can think of are, uh, and again, he discusses this as the idea of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not, right? So we have these moral compass. If you are so inclined to follow the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments are those code of ethics or moral compass based on things that we should not do, based on the things of the negative. Thou shalt not, right? And they all kind of help govern uh, or invented by. So this moral compass of the thou shalt nots are invented by the negative, right? The don't do's, don't do it. Well, as humans, we have that ability to contemplate that. And so when we think about inventor of and invented by the negative, these codes of morality in much of the Western world, there's these code of ethics that are built on the things that we should not do. So, and along with that, he brings in this idea of action versus motion. And so let's parse through the difference. Humans can act versus being in motion. So for Burke, action versus motion. Motion, if you take a look at this picture, we're going to dive into it in a couple different ways. And I know you don't see this because it wasn't the point of the picture, but if you can picture a beach and the water crashing, the waves crashing on the shore, that's motion. It's driven by the physics of the wind and of the currents and things like that. For Burke, action equals motion plus motive, meaning that there's motivation in motive or in motion that makes it an action. So there's a purpose, there's a reason behind that is not done, that is only done through the human, right? So there can be motion without action, such as the waves, but there cannot be action without motion. Meaning there's always a reason why we do something, why we choose the language that we choose, why we act a certain way. So let's take a look at this picture one more time. This is an image of the spring breakers last week on Miami Beach. Um, uh, After the suggestion to social distance had gone out. And so we have these folks who are on the beach in large gatherings despite the warnings or despite the suggestions for social distancing to perhaps mitigate the circulation or spread of the COVID-19 virus. And so there's motivation behind there, right? And so if we look at through that code of morality, of we had these suggestions by the local, state, and federal government to social distance, like the don't accumulate in groups of more than 10, don't get within 6 feet of one another. I think at some point it was 10 feet, I think it's 6 feet now. So we are invented by or even governed by these codes of negatives, right? So there's motivation for these spring breakers, and whether or not we think that they are bound within this idea of codes of morality is obviously up for suggestion. So it's a little bit muddier of a term than just saying what is and what isn't. It's a table, it's not a table, it's right or it's wrong, or somewhere in between, right? So that's the idea of where we look at this idea of being invented or inventor of or invented by the negative when we get into these more abstract concepts of what is governing that motivation. So there were some interviews of the younger folks who were like, we had these plans, we weren't going to break them, we're living day by day, if they get the virus they get the virus, and so those are the motivations behind the actions of being on the beach despite the warnings. um, and so one of the other aspects with this is to use language at all. It implies a sense of negativity as when language is used properly. And that word's kind of wonky when it is used in a way that's intended. But we can also have that conversation with regards to properly. We've talked about that. Now we've set up this what's correct language, what's not correct language. In this particular example, Burke is looking at it as language or the use of language requiring knowledge of what things are not to be in command of things such as irony or metaphor, right? To understand, let's say, the figurative language or the idioms of a particular language when you are in that discourse community or language community, that you understand it to the sense that you can interpret or get irony or metaphor. And so I have a really silly example that will round out this particular piece. Yes, this is a children's book. I apologize for that. But this is Amelia Bedelia, and it's a book I used a lot in when I was teaching K-12 because it helped to introduce idioms, right? So who knew that I could pull Burke in or pull this into Burke? And this is a really silly example, but it's the idea of understanding that something isn't, right? We speak and we live in a sea of metaphors. There's one right there. Uh, and so, in order for us to understand the metaphor, we've got to understand the not, the negative. So, this particular example, you may or may not be familiar with the book, or the series of books, but this is one of the first ones. It says, Amelia Bedelia, the sun will fade the furniture. I asked you to draw the drapes, said Mrs. Rogers. I did. See, said Amelia Bedelia. She held up her picture. So the idiom of draw the drapes was figurative language, right? And what she meant was to close the drapes. But she spoke in a way that required Amelia Bedelia to really understand what she did not mean in order to understand what she did mean. So Amelia Bedelia took it very literally and she drew the drapes. She drew a picture of the drapes. So again, this is another aspect of Burke's kind of inventor of or invented by the negative. And he does discuss and he focuses on the metaphor in much of his writing. The next one we want to talk about is the Burke separated from natural conditions by instruments of our own making. And this is the idea that Burke suggests that humans are more than just a tool making animal. That we are an animal that has made tools to make tools in some ways, and that those tools then have created the very conditions that have now separated us from the natural condition. And so, this idea of natural condition we is kind of a slippery slope, but it is Burke's point in that if we look at natural condition of a living thing, food, shelter, this is one of the conversations that will happen with with this particular piece. Food, shelter, homeostasis, light, water, that natural conditions of ways to be a living creature. And yet, as humans, because we are symbol making, symbol using, symbol misusing animals, we also create tools, and those tools then are shift our view or shift how we would interpret or look at what the natural condition is. And unlike animals that use tools when necessity dictates, humans have tools that govern their tools, such as words about words. And then there's this tie between the tools that we create and that we use and the language that we use in order to uh, discuss or describe them. So one of the biggest examples we can look at or to start is going back to, let's say, the 19th century. Let's look at the Industrial Revolution, because we're just kind of coming out of that piece in our conversations. Is that what did we see there? We saw a shift in where people were living, in the labor that was happening. We see the factories, so we see this technology, and Burke is very leery of technology. He has several conversations where technology will be to our detriment. So if we look at the industrial revolution and this idea of factories, we built these tools, we created these tools, then we had to have symbols or language in order to not only name the tool, but describe the tool, teach the tool, advance the tool, and that tool then gets incorporated into our lives. And so we see this idea of natural conditions. We are further and further apart from whatever that original definition is, and so our idea of natural conditions begins to evolve and change based on those tools and the language that we use with them. So, a silly example that, or this is what made me think of this, is this idea of Zoom. Um, we have this tool now. Now that we are all social distancing, we have this tool in order to stay connected. Um, and so this tool allows us, this technology allows us to create a quasi face-to-face environment. This is where I know for me, with all the meetings and different things, this is where we live. I get Zoom meetings constantly being put on my calendar now, so that we can log in and have these kind of face-to-face. So now we have this tool of Zoom technology. We've named it, but now there's also acts or actions behind it. Because when I think of Zoom, I think of, and sometimes just because I'm not a big fan of meetings, it's that here we go. So I now look at or use this tool in a way that has shaped natural conditions. Um, to extend that just a teeny bit, we are now living in a time when I'm sure many of us would probably describe our natural condition as needing the technology in order to get by. So we want to continue this semester and finish the semester. We can't do that unless we have access to the tools in order to engage in the learning that needs to take place to finish the semester. So um, we are now separated from a natural condition of, let's say, just being and living, because the instruments that we need in order to finish the semester, in our sense, just bringing it to that example, now include these different tools that we have to use, and then the language that we need in order to navigate and function with them. Um, the next piece is goaded by the spirit of hierarchy and moved by the sense of order. So when we think about this, um, Burke is talking about this idea that humans are drawn to status and order. We'll spend just a couple of minutes on this just for the sake of time, but I want to talk about two things. One is status and one is order, talking more a little bit about order versus status. So in Burke's mind, we are driven to this idea of always understanding our place in relation to others, right? This idea of hierarchy, we can't get out of it. What is our status within our family? What is our status within our education? What is our status within our job? What is our status with our friends? That we're always driven by this idea of understanding where we are in relation to each other. So can't get out of that hierarchy. This will be interesting. We'll connect this when we get into Foucault with never being able to live outside this hierarchy. But for Burke, we are goaded by this spirit of always understanding and knowing our status. And with that, we also, for Burke, have this idea of always needing to have order, always needing to put things in order, always needing to create order within our world, and even to the sense of understanding different processes, of knowing what comes first, what comes next, um, and many ways in which we think the world should be, right? So think about that when we say the many ways in which we think the world should be. What our order is our perspective, right? That perspective drives what we do, how we do it, the language that we use to discuss it, respond to it. That becomes a slippery slope because, again, it's our perspective. We're going to look at this a little bit more when we get into, or a lot more when we get into the dramatistic pentad and looking at perspectives and motivation. The final thing that brings his definition of man kind of to the end of those five claims is that we are rotten with perfection, right? That we're always striving for perfection and hoping to reach a high status. We can kind of connect that to that last one, where we're goaded by the spirit of hierarchy and order, is that because of that, we are rotten with perfection. We're always trying to be the best student. We're always trying to be the best worker, the best friend. We are doing things like climbing Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a pile of dirt and rocks that raised up. Why do we feel the need to climb it? Because we're rotten with perfection. We struggle with perfection. And When we say struggle, or when Burke says struggle, he looks at it from the sense of being enabling us to reach our goals, commendable goals and progress. But Burke also sees this goal of perfection as also dangerous. So if we look at this idea of striving for perfection, our version of perfection, whatever that may be, or each individual's version of perfection and what that may be, then the motivation that we have to reach those goals could be dangerous for, let's say, a larger context or for others. I think we can see some of that throughout history, which again we can talk about in further discussions on a discussion board. So these five round out Burke's definition of man. Again, I want us to take this conversation to a discussion board to think about how these work together. So the fact that we're symbol using, symbol making, symbol misusing animals, we are the inventor of the negative, separated from our natural condition by the instruments of our own making, goaded by the spirit of hierarchy, and then rotten with perfection. So while we brought these out onto an individual level, I want us to then think about these all do work together and help us give an idea as we continue our journey with Burke in his centrality of language and motivations and symbols. And so I'll leave you with this quote. Rhetoric is rooted in an essential function of language itself, just kind of wrapping up, taking it back to the beginning, a function that is wholly realistic and continually born anew. The use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. So that is the end of our first video. We'll move over to part 2, but before you do, let's go ahead and engage in a discussion board just on definition of man. So you'll see that on the particular page, and we'll focus on that. And then we will get into the second video in this series, which will focus completely on the dramatistic pentad, looking at terministic screens and Burke's identity. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in just a little bit.